In this video, we'll take a look at the properties of columns in a form changing based on the value of an associated yes/no changing. So columns go in business required and unlocked, or not business required and locked based on the value of the yes/no changing. That's all driven by JavaScript, but it's JavaScript that is configurable through a front-end table. So let's take a look. Hello and welcome to this video, and welcome to my channel, because this is the first video that I've recorded for my channel. And my channel is going to be about Microsoft Dynamics 365 CE and the Power Platform. So I'm going to be looking at things like model-driven apps, Canvas Power Apps, Power Pages, Power Automate, SharePoint, all that sort of stuff. And hopefully if the channel progresses, I'll look at other aspects of Microsoft 365 as well. This is something that I've wanted to do for years, but for one reason or another, I've just put it off and put it off. But now I'm just going to go for it. And if it works, it works. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. But at least I will have tried. You'll be able to tell already that I have an accent. I'm from Northern Ireland, so I hope you can understand what I'm saying. And this is as animated and dynamic as my voice gets, I'm afraid. Now, in this video and in this video series, we're going to look at JavaScript and model-driven apps. But it's JavaScript that can be configured through front-end tables. And in this first video, we're going to look at changing the properties of columns based on the value of an associated yes/no changing. So let's take a look at that functionality now. So on this inspection form, we have several sections, and one of the sections is the planning section. It's a yes/no, a user lookup, and a date. And at the minute, the yes/no is sitting at no, and the user lookup and the date are both not business required and locked. But if I flick the yes/no to yes, then the user lookup and date will both become business required and unlocked, and the values will default to, the user lookup gets defaulted to the current user, and the date gets defaulted to today's date. And other sections on this form will work in much the same way. And while I will talk about user lookups and dates, you can have other columns associated to the yes/no as well. So for example, that's a currency column, and you'll get the same sort of functionality as you flick this from yes to no and back again, apart from the fact that the currency isn't getting defaulted. Now, this functionality, or most of this functionality, can be done through a business rule. And this section, controlled by business rule, is controlled by business rule. It's not controlled by JavaScript. And if I flick the yes/no from yes to no and back again, you'll see much the same functionality apart from the defaulting. The business rule itself is pretty straightforward. If the yes/no is yes, then unlock and set the user lookup to be business required. Do the same for the date. If the yes/no is no, then lock, clear, and set the user lookup to be not business required, and do the same for the date. So a pretty straightforward business rule, but by the time you drag and drop each of the components in, fill them in, click apply, click validate, click activate, it still takes a couple of minutes to do. And this is something that I need to do multiple times on an application, because you're always looking to record whether something has been done, and if it has been done, who did it and when they did it. So you have this multiple times on a form with multiple forms or tables on an application. It just becomes really tedious to do through business rules. So the alternative is to use JavaScript, and that's what I did, and that's how I started writing JavaScript for model-driven apps, was writing JavaScript to make these user interface changes. I then started learning about the XRM Web API, so the ability to do CRUD operations through JavaScript, so creating, retrieving or reading, updating and deleting records. And then eventually I thought, well, could I combine the two? Could I pull the logical names out of the JavaScript and put them onto the configuration table? And that's what I've done, and that's how this is working. So let's take a look at the configuration table. So it's the user interface rules table, and it's a pretty simple table. The table column then holds the table name, so that the form that the table is running against. So for example, we were looking at the inspection form. So those are the inspection records there that will run on that form. The source then is the yes/no, and the target then would be your user lookup or your date or your fee or whatever other column you want to associate to the yes/no. The defaulting then is just a simple yes/no, and it will only work if it's a user lookup or a date. User lookup defaults to the current, date defaults to today's date. You'll notice the currency field is set to default, but nothing will happen. The currency field will not default, but the same way the code won't break if that is sitting at yes for a currency field. You'll also note that I need to use logical names. So I'm using logical names at the minute, but I am working on another version of this, which will use display names, and the next version will have more defaulting options as well, rather than the pretty simple defaulting options at the minute. So that's the table. Pretty simple. Before I move on to the code though, there's a few other things I want to show on the front end functionality, and that is the new form for the user interface rule record, because there's a bit of validation on this that I want to discuss. So I will get rid of Copilot just for now. So the table column is validated, and it has to be a valid table on this Dataverse, on this environment. And then once you have a valid table in, then the source and the target have to be valid column names on that table. So I'll just use the autofill and put in the inspection table. So that is a valid table on this Dataverse. And if I take the focus off the field, then source and target will both become unlocked because that is a valid table. If I was to put in some rubbish after that table name, then that's obviously not a valid table. If I take the focus off, then I get told it's not a valid table, and source and target go back to being locked. Again, if I put that back to being a valid table, take the focus off, source and target become unlocked, allowing me to put in values into those fields. And as I say, those have to be valid column names on that table. So if I'm going to cut and paste in a valid column name, then that should be fine. And I'll cut and paste another valid column name into target. And again, that validates fine. But if I put in some rubbish after that, I get told that's an invalid column name and the same. So I'll discuss the code for that as well in a bit when we look at the code. But just so you know, there's validation on that new form. And again, we'll see this in action in the demo. Now, if I go back out of that, discard that, there's one final piece of front-end functionality I want to show before we get into the code, and that's in the settings section. And if I go into the settings record, there is only one setting here, and it's for form validation on for the user interface rules. So I'm going to turn that off, and I will go back to user interface rules and click on new, and you'll see now that that validation has been turned off because that setting has been set to no. And if I go back into settings, back into the settings record, flick that back to yes, back into user interface rules, and back into new, then now you'll see that the validation's turned on. So that's all the front end functionality. So now let's look at the JavaScript code that's making all this work. Okay, so let's take a look at the code, the JavaScript code that's making this work. So I'll go into XRM Toolbox, and I'm using the Web Resources Manager tool. So this is the JavaScript that is making the end user front end forms work. So whenever we change the value of the yes, no, the column properties changing, business required, unlocked, back to being not business required, unlocked and cleared. So it starts off, we pass in the execution context. From that, we get the form context. And then from the form context, we get the table name. I then have a little routine in here where I'm setting any yes, no columns that are coming in as null, setting them to no. So just making sure that there's no values coming in for those yes, no's, that they'll always be set to no if they are null. But then going back then to building the query string up. So we use that table name, and along with the table name, then we bring back active records, and we bring back the values, the table, the source, the target, and the default. Those are the columns that we saw whenever we looked at the user interface rules table, because those are the columns that we need to make the functionality work. I then use the xrm.webapi.retrieve multiple records, and I obviously want to bring back records from that user interface rule table, that configuration table, and I pass in the query string to get the records back from that user interface rule table that I want. And then if I get any results back, then I call the apply UI rules function. And that apply UI rules function really just cycles through each of the records that we get back from the retrieve multiple records call. And in that then, once we're cycling through those records, we call the apply UI rule function. And it's that apply UI rule function that is changing the properties on the columns. And this is essentially the business rule that we looked at earlier in JavaScript form. So if the yes, no is yes, then we set required level to be required, in other words, make it business required. We set disabled to be false, in other words, make it unlocked. And then if the default is true, then we do the defaulting. Else if it's no, we set the required level to be none, in other words, not business required. We set disabled to be true, in other words, lock it. And we set the value to be null, in other words, clear any values. The rest of this then is just defaulting the values. So again, the date field gets defaulted to today's date, and the user lookup gets defaulted to the current user. So pretty straightforward. I used Claude AI to help me write this. It just short circuits everything. It just makes everything so much quicker. I'm not a pro developer. I'm a consultant who likes to develop. So AI and Claude AI specifically, in my experience, has been a great help to me. I could have written this myself. I would have got there eventually, but it just speeds up the whole process for me, allowing me to get on to other things. So that is that piece of JavaScript. The next piece of JavaScript I want to look at then is the JavaScript that runs whenever you're creating a new record on the user interface rules table. So that validation of the table and the validation of the two column name columns. So the first section here then is checking the validation settings. So the other piece of functionality we looked at was that little yes, no setting that turned that validation on and off. So that is going off and getting that settings value and finding out whether that's set to yes or no. If it is set to yes, sorry, if it's set to no, then we don't want to run the validation, and then we just return, we get out of there. We don't do the rest of this JavaScript. However, if the validation is on and we want to continue with the validation for the new form, then we continue with the JavaScript. And there's just a couple of pieces that I want to show on this, and they really are almost the same thing. The first is the validation of the table. The second is the validation of the column name, but they're the same call in JavaScript, or similar call. And it's the xrm.utility.getEntityMetadata. And for the table name, we simply pass in the table name. And if you get any metadata back, then it's a valid table. Else, if you don't get any metadata back, then it's an invalid table. And then the validation for the column name, for the source and for the target is very, very similar. It's the same call, but as well as passing in the table name, we then pass in the column name. Now you can't pass in an array here, but I'm just passing in the value that's in the source, and then I call it again to pass in the value that's in the target, and I check as to whether they are valid column names for that table. So that's how that's done. It's the same call, but just if you're validating the column name, you just add in the column name as a parameter, and that's it. So that's how that JavaScript works. What I'd like to do now is I'd like to do a couple of demos to show you how I implement this functionality. Okay, so now I'd like to do a couple of demonstrations to show how this functionality can be implemented. The first demonstration is going to be on the incident table. So I'm in the incident form here. And this form has the JavaScript already loaded as a form library, and the onload event is set up. So these two sections, the functionality works as expected. But these two sections, report drafted and report approved, nothing is happening. So all I should need to do then is add in the configuration records for these columns, and that should be them working. So let's do that now. So if I go into my, no, before I do that, sorry, what I want to do is I want to pull up logical names, because I'm going to use level up, and I am basically going to cut and paste these logical names into the configuration records. I'm going to move this onto my second screen and get it out of the way. And then I'll go into the settings section and the user interface rules, and then click new. And there we go, we have the validation turned on. So fair warning, this is a bit cut and pasty, but I have to show how this functionality can be implemented. So what I'm going to do to start with is get the table name from the query string and pop that in. That's a valid table, and now I can cut and paste my column names in. So start with the report drafted yes, no, and then the report drafted date. Sorry, the user lookup first of all will do, and we'll default that. And then I'm just going to use the user lookups label as the name, save, new, and again the table from the query string. Now, yeah, you might know that the autofill pop-ups will have most of the information that I need in them, but I'm just going to ignore them because I've recorded this video so many times that all the information I need will be there, but I'll just ignore that and just cut and paste as you would normally. So again, the yes, no goes in, and this time the date goes in for the target. I will default that. I will get the dates label in, save, and new. And then we'll move on to report approved. So again, the table needs to go in. The yes, no for the source, this time the report approved. And then the user lookup, and then the label. And we'll leave the defaulting off for now just to show that. Save, new, and then last one, get the table name in. Oh, Copilot's been very helpful. Okay, we will use the report approved yes, no, and the date. Again, leave the defaulting off, and we will take the label for the name. Click save on that, go back to user interface rules, and there's those values. So that all looks fine, yeah, and we'll leave the defaulting off, as I said. So back into the application, back into incidents this time, and into the record. Well, we can see the locks are in place, so that's a good sign. And if I click yes, then the functionality works as expected. If I click yes, the functionality works. Okay, but let's say, no, we meant to default those, that's a mistake. Well, all you have to do is go back into settings, enter user interface rules, and then have the editable grid, but I can just go back into the record. Click that, save and close that. Or of course, just use the editable grid and change that to yes. And if I now go back to incidents, and then there we go, that's defaulting as expected. So that's one demonstration using the new form. The next demonstration, I would like to use the investigations table. Now, the investigations table does not have the JavaScript added as a form library yet, so we're going to do that. And then I'm going to use the editable grid to add in the information. So I'm going to turn off the validation, create the records very quickly just by putting in a name, and then use the editable grid to fill in the rest of the information. So let's go into the maker portal, the investigation form. Yes, that is the form I want. So I can add the library in. In fact, let me just go back and just show you that from the start. Okay, so you would go into your table, into investigation, into forms, and then you'd open up your main form. And then when that form opens up, you'd click into form libraries and then add library. Search for it, search for apply. There we go, apply UI rules. We'll get the form notifications in a future video. Click apply, click into events, onload, and you need to know what it's called. It's called onload for in this case, and you need to remember to pass in your execution context, and that's it. Done. And that's it. As far as JavaScript goes, that form is good to go. So that will save and publish in the background. And while that's saving and publishing, what I'll do then is I will go back to my investigations form. And again, I am going to, I'll bring this back in. And I'm going to go into investigations. I'm going to into investigations again, and I will pull up, level up, pull up the logical names. Okay, so I need those logical names. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to move that back over, and again I'm going to cut and paste. And again, apologies. Again, it's a bit cut and pasty, but there's nothing I can do about that. Again, I want to show demonstrate the functionality. So into the user interface rules, down into settings, and then into this. And I'm going to turn this validation off. Back into user interface rules, click new, and then I'm just going to create a few records very quickly, just using the name. So I want report prepared by, save new, report date, save new, internally by, internally date, and then report approved externally. And this is a contact lookup rather than a user lookup. Again, just to show that it doesn't have to be user lookups and dates, it can be other columns. And then the externally date, and then a currency column, the fee. Okay, back to user interface rules, and we'll stay in the editable grid, and then we'll start filling this information in. So I'm going to grab the table name from the query string, and then start filling this in. Okay, and we'll do report prepared. So that's the yes, no. Pop that in, and then the user lookup. The by goes in, and the date goes in. And then the internally, yes, no, and the by, and the date. And the externally, yes, no, the externally, yes, no, and the externally, yes, no. And then the lookup, which in this case, as I said, is a contact lookup, the date, and the fee, the currency. And okay, let's default. So we don't need to default the contact lookup or the currency, but we'll default the date. We'll default that, and that. Okay, that should be that sorted into the, yeah, that looks fine. Okay, so back into our application then, into investigations. And again, we see the locks, which again is a good sign. And if I flick those all to yes, then we see the functionality as expected, and just yes, there's the contact lookup, and then that is a currency. So there you go. There's a couple of demonstrations as to how this functionality can be implemented. So there we go. That was the first video on user interface rules, and the first video on this series of configurable JavaScript that I'm going to be looking at. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you've got this far, thank you very much for watching. I know this was pretty dry. I think the rest of the videos in this series should be a bit more interesting, as they should be more applicable to model-driven apps in general. But this is how I started doing this stuff, so it gets to be the first video. As I said, this is the first video in my channel, so the video editing is going to be a bit rubbish, and my delivery is going to be stilted and unsteady and unsure of itself at times. Hopefully that will improve as time goes on. I'll learn and I'll get better. But I hope you have enjoyed this video. I hope you find it useful. If you have, please let me know in the comments, and please give me any feedback at all, because goodness knows I need feedback at this stage. And I hope you'll join me in the next video. Cheers. Good luck.